Something strange is unfolding in the gospel world, something far deeper than a casual slip of the tongue. Because when Yolanda Adams, one of the most beloved and respected voices in modern gospel, a woman whose name has been synonymous with vocal excellence and spiritual authority for decades, publicly referred to God as He, the reaction wasn't mild, wasn't casual, wasn't just routine commentary. It exploded across the gospel community like lightning striking dry ground, sparking confusion, backlash, and a growing storm of whispers that have only intensified with every passing hour, because behind that one word lies a decades-long debate, quietly simmering beneath the surface of Black church culture, theological institutions, and worship music itself. A debate that many pastors, gospel artists, and believers have been wrestling with in private long before Yolanda Adams said anything at all. But before we dive into the firestorm now circling her name, you have to understand something critical. Moments like this never appear out of nowhere, they grow quietly underground, fed by tension, tradition, and unspoken disagreements, until one unexpected spark cracks open the silence. And that spark, this time, was Yolanda Adams, a pillar of gospel excellence whose voice has carried believers through grief, triumph, worship, and spiritual transformation. So when she spoke, people didn't just listen, they reacted viscerally, emotionally, and immediately. Some defended her with fierce loyalty, arguing she said nothing wrong. Others questioned whether her language reinforced harmful limitations about the nature of God, and many in the middle wondered how such a seemingly simple reference could ignite a debate so heated that within minutes entire comment sections turned into theological battlegrounds. Because what happened next wasn't typical fan chatter, it was far deeper. It was the eruption of a conversation long waiting to be confronted. The moment the clip surfaced, Twitter timelines detonated with heated threads. Instagram stories turned into open commentary zones. TikTok creators dissected her phrase word by word, and gospel discussion pages lit up with passionate voices on every side of the debate. This wasn't just gossip. This was culture shifting in real time. People weren't reacting to Yolanda Adams alone. They were reacting to what her words symbolized in a world where gospel artists have enormous influence, shaping theology, shaping language, shaping identity, sometimes without even realizing it. Because beneath that single comment lies a generational tension around how we speak about the divine and how that language shapes the faith of millions. For generations, many churches across the country, especially in traditional Black church spaces, have used masculine language for God. It's familiar, it's historical, it's scriptural to many, and it's deeply woven into sermons, hymns, iconic gospel songs, and cultural expressions of faith. But in recent years, a growing number of believers, theologians, scholars, and younger Christians have challenged this tradition, pointing out that God transcends gender, that reducing God to masculinity can reinforce patriarchal attitudes, and that speaking of God exclusively as He may influence how people understand authority, leadership, and spiritual power itself. For years, this debate lived quietly in academic conversations, theology classrooms, seminary circles, and private discussions among worship leaders, gently, respectfully, and often behind closed doors. But when gospel artists, particularly influential ones with enormous reach, use gendered language, the conversation doesn't stay contained. It becomes mainstream, it becomes emotional, it becomes personal. So when Yolanda Adams used the word he, it wasn't a neutral phrase. For many, it was a reminder of an imbalance they have been fighting to correct. For others, it was a cherished affirmation of tradition they want to preserve. And for a large portion of the gospel community, it felt like a collision between two eras of belief, the old and the new, the inherited faith and the evolving understanding, the familiar and the transformative. And that collision is exactly why the reaction was so intense. This wasn't just theology, it was culture, it was identity. It was about voice, representation, and the power of language in shaping how generations understand God. Some people felt empowered to finally speak truths they had been holding for years. Others felt something sacred was being challenged too quickly. And gospel music, which has always served as the cultural heartbeat of Black faith, once again became the battleground for a much bigger struggle. Gospel artists aren't just entertainers, they are spiritual influencers. Their words create belief. Their lyrics shape theology. Their performances become doctrine for people who may never read systematic theology or attend seminary. So when Yolanda spoke, people didn't just hear a phrase, they heard an entire legacy. They heard a direction. They heard influence. And just when the conversation reached peak intensity, something unexpected happened. other gospel artists, quietly watching the storm unfold, began chiming in one by one, some supporting Yolanda Adams, some gently challenging her, and others revealing that they too have wrestled privately with how to speak about a God who transcends gender. And that is when the entire narrative shifted dramatically, opening the door to a much larger, deeper, and far more explosive conversation that no one, including Yolanda Adams, was fully prepared for. Because what comes next doesn't just involve her, it pulls in the voices, beliefs, fears, and convictions of gospel giants across the industry, and that's where this story becomes truly unbelievable. What happened after the initial backlash is what truly transformed Yolanda Adams's moment from a passing social media flare-up into a full, roaring cultural earthquake shaking the foundations of the gospel world. Because as soon as gospel artists, the very voices millions trust, follow, worship with, and build their spiritual identities around, began responding, the tone shifted dramatically, and what started as murmurs became a storm. It began quietly, with subtle posts, vague captions, indirect statements that didn't mention Yolanda by name but clearly hinted at the growing controversy, and within hours those whispers turned into open declarations as gospel singers, worship leaders, musicians, choir directors, and even church influencers stepped forward with their own beliefs, frustrations, theological convictions, and emotional reactions to the question of whether God should still be described using masculine language. Suddenly lines were drawn. Some artists defended Yolanda with reverence, insisting she said nothing wrong and was simply speaking in the language of scripture, tradition, and church upbringing, reminding their followers that thousands of churches across the world refer to God using he, and that the Bible itself uses masculine pronouns in countless passages. They insisted that this wasn't rebellion, wasn't heresy, wasn't modern confusion. This was continuity, the familiar rhythm believers have always used when expressing reverence. But not everyone stood with that perspective. A wave of other artists spoke boldly, passionately, and without apology, arguing that modern believers must move beyond limiting language, insisting that gospel artists, who hold massive influence and shape spiritual language for entire generations, have a responsibility to speak inclusively and reflect a fuller, more expansive theological understanding of God that transcends gender entirely. They challenged tradition head-on, asking whether comfort in old norms was preventing necessary growth. That pushback cracked something open. What had seemed like a drama centered around Yolanda Adams suddenly revealed itself as a mirror exposing deep, long-buried divisions within gospel culture. Divisions about theology, identity, tradition, gender, and the power artists wield when they open their mouths. Behind closed doors, private group chats buzzed. Gospel studios became war rooms. Rehearsal spaces turned into roundtable debates. Fans watched their favorite artists take sides and didn't know who to follow, who to believe, or which version of faith made them feel understood. Then came the shock no one expected. Some artists who never speak during controversies, artists who avoid conflict like the plague, suddenly broke their silence with raw honesty. They admitted they had struggled for years with the language in their songs. They confessed they'd been pressured by producers, pastors, and label executives to stay theologically safe and avoid gender-neutral language, because it might confuse the saints or risk backlash. They revealed they had long wanted to challenge the old norms but feared exactly the kind of explosion Yolanda Adams was now living through. Their transparency was like the opening of a floodgate. The comment that started this wasn't just a slip. It was the spark that exposed a generation of gospel artists wrestling privately with how to describe God in a world that's changing faster than the church is comfortable with. Just when it seemed the conversation had settled into a tug-of-war between traditionalists and reformers, someone entered the discussion who completely shifted its trajectory: a theologian, a respected scholar known for accuracy, depth, and nuance, someone who rarely engages in public controversy but whose voice carries tremendous weight behind the scenes. When this scholar released a calm, deeply researched, beautifully articulated video explaining that all language for God is symbolic, never literal, and that ancient cultures used masculine language not because God is male, but because human civilization at that time recognized only male authority, everything changed instantly. Their explanation wasn't aggressive, it wasn't dismissive, it wasn't condescending, it was enlightening. It reframed the entire debate with one sweeping message: the language we use for God is a reflection of culture, not a definition of God. The video hit the gospel world like a shockwave. Suddenly, gospel fans, pastors, choir members, youth leaders, and even the artists themselves were sharing the clip with captions like, "This changes everything," and "Why weren't we taught this decades ago?" But instead of calming the controversy, the scholar's explanation deepened it. People began asking new questions. Should gospel artists evolve the language they use? Should modern churches reconsider how they talk about the divine? Should believers challenge language that might reinforce unconscious biases? And in the center of all this, Yolanda Adams remained silent. No interview, no response, no clarification. Her silence was deafening, and the longer she remained quiet, the more speculation grew. Was she reflecting? Was she avoiding backlash? Was she being advised to wait? Or was she watching the conversation evolve far beyond anything she originally intended? That silence created a vacuum, and into that vacuum poured fans, critics, theologians, TikTok preachers, pastors, and influencers, each projecting their own interpretation onto her moment. And just when the debate reached its boiling point, something happened that no one expected. A short, grainy audio clip began circulating online. A clip that would take this already volatile situation and push it into a direction so shocking, so intense, and so explosive that it threatened to reshape the gospel community's conversations for years to come. What happened next pushed the Yolanda Adams controversy far beyond anything the gospel world expected, because once that grainy backstage audio clip started spreading, first in private group chats, then leaked across fan pages, and eventually exploding onto every major social platform, it cracked open the polished image of the gospel industry in a way that felt raw, unfiltered, and almost uncomfortable to watch unfold. The clip, allegedly recorded behind the scenes at a major gospel concert, captured two well-known artists speaking candidly, believing they were in a private moment, revealing frustrations they had carried quietly for years. And the shock wasn't just in their words but in the honesty with which they spoke. One artist said they were exhausted from walking on eggshells every time they spoke about God in interviews or during performances, admitting that public reactions had become so unpredictable that even the most traditional phrases triggered controversy. The other responded with equal intensity, insisting that conversations like the one happening around Yolanda Adams had been necessary for years. But gospel artists shouldn't be expected to correct theological misunderstandings embedded in church culture for generations. Then came the revelation that shook the entire gospel world. These artists admitted that numerous big-name gospel figures had been wrestling privately with the language they used to describe God, debating it, questioning it, hesitating to address it publicly, and some even confessed they personally felt conflicted about calling God He, but continued doing it because they feared backlash, feared disappointing church leaders, feared losing longtime supporters, or simply because that's what sells. The audio was emotional, unpolished, and unscripted, lifting the veil on what many suspected but had never heard confirmed. And yet the real earthquake came from the reactions. Some listeners felt validated, saying the clip proved the industry was more aware and conflicted about theology than it publicly admitted. Others were furious, accusing the artists of hypocrisy, saying it was cowardly to struggle privately but perform publicly as if they were untouched by the debate. Meanwhile, another large portion of the gospel community sympathized deeply with the artists, recognizing the impossible expectation placed on them to satisfy tradition, culture, and evolving understanding at the same time. But one question hung in the air louder than all the others. Would Yolanda Adams finally respond now that the conversation wasn't just about her? It was about the entire gospel industry and the way it shapes spiritual language. For days, it felt like the gospel world was collectively holding its breath. Every timeline, every TikTok stitch, every Instagram comment section repeated the same question: when is Yolanda going to say something? And then, without warning, she did. But not through a polished video or a carefully worded PR statement, and not through a lengthy written response. Early one morning, Yolanda Adams simply went live. No glam, no lighting setup, no professional backdrop, just her phone, her sincerity, and thousands of people who joined instantly because they sensed this was the moment the entire conversation would shift. She didn't jump into defense, didn't lash out, didn't make excuses or point fingers. Instead, she began by acknowledging the emotional tension rippling across the gospel community, addressing the swirling debates without directly mentioning the leaked audio. Then she did something stunning. Instead of diving into theology or trying to correct the record, she shared her spiritual upbringing, how she learned to pray, how she learned to worship, and the language her family and church used to describe God when she was a child. She explained that calling God He wasn't a doctrinal declaration for her, it was simply the language of her roots, the way she was raised to connect with the divine. But then she pivoted into a statement that dropped like a revelation across thousands of screens. However you connect with God, however you experience God, that relationship is valid. God is bigger than language, bigger than pronouns, bigger than anything we can fit into a sentence. With those few sentences, she didn't erase the controversy, but she reframed it entirely. Comment sections instantly filled with emotional reactions, some crying, some relieved, some stunned into silence. Even critics who had been waiting for a defensive or evasive response were unexpectedly disarmed by her calmness and vulnerability. Her words weren't an apology nor a rebuttal, they were an invitation to think deeper. Supporters praised her wisdom. Critics argued she dodged accountability. Scholars immediately jumped in to analyze her perspective. But the most profound reactions came from ordinary believers, the people who had listened to her music for decades, who had worshipped with her voice guiding them through grief, struggle, joy, and healing. Countless viewers said her words helped them reflect on their own relationship with God, not through pressure but through clarity and compassion. And yet Yolanda's message sparked a new, much bigger question, one that struck at the heart of the entire controversy. If gospel artists are shaping the spiritual language of millions, what responsibility do they carry when culture shifts and believers begin seeing God in broader, more inclusive, more expansive ways? In other words, the conversation was no longer, "Why'd Yolanda say that?" It had become, how much power do gospel artists hold when their words shape the faith of generations? And with that, the story moved into a deeper, richer, far more complicated chapter, one that would push the gospel world into a reflection it had avoided for decades.